Darkness fell over Europe long before the bombs of 1939. In the silence of economic despair, a radical movement found its voice, promising revival while plotting domination. Out of beer halls and prison writings emerged a figure who would harness mass media, terror, and myth to forge a Reich unlike any the continent had seen. But was Nazi Germany inevitable, or a fragile accident of history? As millions rallied beneath banners and symbols, the world held its breath. Behind the parades lurked concentration camps. Behind the speeches, a war machine sharpening its claws. This is the story of a society seduced, transformed, and consumed by its own vision of destiny. From the rise of Adolf Hitler to the total collapse of the Third Reich, we trace the forces, the battles, and the lives entangled in the making and unmaking of Nazi Germany. The Wounds of Versailles. The First World War ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. 4 years of slaughter had drained Europe's lifeblood. By November 1918, the German Empire, the Kaiserreich, collapsed from within. On a railway carriage in Compiègne, France, German envoys signed an armistice that silenced the guns but not the fury. Soldiers trudged home to a country unrecognizable, burdened by hunger, grief, and a sense of betrayal. In June 1919, the victors of Versailles imposed terms unlike any Germany had known. The treaty stripped the Reich of Alsace-Lorraine, its colonies in Africa and the Pacific, and slices of territory awarded to Poland, Denmark, and France. The army, once Europe's pride, was capped at 100,000 men. The navy, forbidden submarines. The air force, dissolved entirely. Reparations, set at 132 billion gold marks, loomed like a debt no generation could hope to repay. The treaty's infamous Article 231, the war guilt clause, branded Germany the sole aggressor. For many Germans, this was not justice, but humiliation etched into law. The Kaiser was gone, replaced by a fragile parliamentary experiment, the Weimar Republic, already despised by monarchists, radicals, and many ordinary citizens who saw in democracy only weakness. By 1923, economic chaos reached its grotesque climax. Hyperinflation devoured savings. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Families pushed wheelbarrows stacked with currency, only to watch its value dissolve by the hour. Workers were sometimes paid twice a day, once in the morning, again in the afternoon, so wages could be spent before they lost worth. Children played with stacks of worthless notes, using them as toys or kindling. Foreign occupation deepened the wound. When Germany faltered on reparations payments, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, its coalfields seized at gunpoint. German workers responded with strikes, but without pay, families starved. The Weimar government printed ever more money to support them, accelerating the inflationary spiral. Hunger bred resentment. The sense of national humiliation became daily, intimate, and unbearable. In this crucible of despair, extremist voices grew louder. Nationalist paramilitaries, the Freikorps, filled taverns with songs of vengeance. In their speeches, a myth took hold, the Dolchstoß-Legende, the stab in the back. It claimed Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by socialists, communists, and Jews at home. This conspiracy, unsupported by fact, carried immense power. It offered ordinary Germans a simple answer to complex trauma: blame the traitors within. But these were not Germany's only voices. In Berlin, another rhythm pulsed. Jazz bands from America played in neon-lit cabarets. Women, newly enfranchised, found work in offices and factories, wearing shorter skirts, cutting hair into bobs. Intellectuals debated in cafes, playwrights and filmmakers tested the boundaries of modernity. The Weimar Republic was also an age of experimentation, of cultural daring. Yet, the juxtaposition was striking. For some Germans, this modernity was liberation. For others, it was decadence, proof that the nation had strayed from discipline and tradition. The Republic embodied both progress and fragility, its contradictions widening with every crisis. Weimar's political system was designed for representation, but too often it produced paralysis. Coalitions fractured, governments rose and fell in months. On the streets, rival militias, communist Red Front fighters and nationalist SA squads brawled openly. The police could not contain them. For many citizens, politics seemed less about stability and more about chaos, a carousel of weak leaders and empty promises. Every crisis, every humiliation, sharpened the appetite for strong leadership. Germans longed for order, certainty, a voice that could restore dignity. But who would provide it? Who could channel the despair of a nation into something more powerful, more dangerous? The early 1920s revealed glimpses of answers. In Bavaria, a failed artist turned soldier began to rise on the fringes of politics. He captivated audiences with fiery speeches, blaming Jews, communists, and foreign powers for Germany's plight. His name was Adolf Hitler. At first, few took him seriously. The German state still functioned, albeit shakily. Foreign loans through the Doors Plan in 1924 stabilized the currency. Cities revived. For a fleeting moment, it seemed Weimar might endure. Yet beneath the recovery, wounds festered. Versailles had not healed. Reparations remained. Veterans remained embittered. Paramilitaries remained armed. And myths of betrayal remained potent, spreading like a virus through newspapers, taverns, and whispered conversations. Would prosperity last? Or would the next shock, economic, political, or military, bring back the shadows waiting in Munich's beer halls? Germany's story after 1918 was not merely about loss. It was about how loss was remembered, mythologized, and weaponized. The treaty, inflation, and humiliation forged a crucible in which radical alternatives could take root. Out of this soil, a movement would grow, one promising renewal, but destined to bring catastrophe. The question remained: who would seize the wounds of Versailles and transform them into a claim for absolute power? The making of a Führer. The Great War had ended, but for one Austrian-born corporal, it was never truly over. Adolf Hitler returned from the Western Front in 1918, decorated with the Iron Cross but stripped of purpose. He was 30 years old, penniless, with no profession, no family, and no future. Yet the war had given him something, a sense of belonging, a belief that sacrifice in the name of the nation was sacred. In the trenches, Hitler had found identity. In defeat, he found obsession. Germany's south was fertile ground for radicals. Bavaria simmered with revolutionary unrest. Communists briefly seized Munich in 1919 before being crushed by right-wing militias. Amid the chaos, the army employed informants to spy on small political groups. Hitler, still technically a soldier, was assigned to watch one such organization, the German Workers' Party. What he found would change the century. The German Workers' Party was tiny, barely a few dozen members, meeting in beer halls thick with smoke. Yet Hitler discovered a new stage. When he spoke, his voice cut through the din. Accounts recall his fiery intensity, his capacity to hold audiences spellbound with gestures and repetition. Anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and nationalist pride fused in his rhetoric. He was invited to join. By 1920, the party renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP. Its new emblem, the swastika, adorned banners and armbands. Its new program called for tearing down Versailles, reviving German greatness, and excluding Jews from citizenship. Hitler was no mere member. He became its star attraction. His speeches drew hundreds, then thousands. He learned how to pace his fury, beginning calm, rising to frenzy, ending in thunder. For the unemployed worker, the embittered veteran, the disoriented youth, here was a voice naming enemies and promising destiny. But rhetoric alone was not enough. To control the streets, the party built muscle. The Sturmabteilung, or SA, known as the Brown Shirts, formed in 1921. Veterans, thugs, and restless young men donned uniforms, marching with flags and fists. They brawled with communists, broke up rival meetings, and turned rallies into displays of power. This militarization gave the movement visibility and menace. It also revealed Hitler's instinct for theater. Rallies blended discipline with chaos, spectacle with intimidation. By now, Hitler had found his gift. He was not a policymaker, nor a thinker in the academic sense. He was a performer, a prophet of resentment. Crowds gave him energy, applause gave him authority. He was discovering the contours of leadership, while Germany's democracy fumbled to find its footing. The turning point came in 1923. Germany, still crippled by reparations, faced hyperinflation. The French occupied the Ruhr. Families burned banknotes for heat. To many, the Weimar Republic had failed once more. Hitler seized the moment. Inspired by Mussolini's march on Rome, he plotted to overthrow Bavaria's government. On the evening of November 8th, Hitler stormed a Munich beer hall, pistol raised, declaring a national revolution. Thousands followed him into the streets. But the coup collapsed within hours. Bavarian police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested, charged with treason. For most politicians, it would have been the end. For Hitler, it was the beginning. In confinement, Hitler dictated his manifesto to Rudolf Hess. The result? Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Part autobiography, part blueprint, it fused personal grievance with radical vision. Germans, he claimed, were a master race destined to rule. Jews were painted as eternal enemies. The state existed to serve one leader, one people. And Germany's salvation lay in Lebensraum, living space to the east, conquered by force. Most scholars agree the book was poorly written, meandering, often incoherent, but its significance was not literary. It was a declaration of intent. Every future crime of the Third Reich lay sketched in those pages. Released in 1924 after serving less than a year, Hitler emerged not as a discredited rebel, but as a national figure. Newspapers had broadcast his trial. Yet the mid-1920s railing against Versailles foreign loans, currency transformed him into a jazz, cinema and Bauhaus design flourished. Berlin thrived, extremists lost ground, the Nazi Party shrank from prominence. Hitler, banned from public speaking for 2 years, reorganized quietly. He centralized authority, remade the party into a machine. Local branches spread across Germany. Propaganda became systematic. Joseph Goebbels, a fiery young journalist, rose as master of messaging. He turned Hitler into a mythic figure, the Führer. Posters, slogans and rallies elevated him from politician to savior. The Nazi newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, carried his voice into homes. Still, success was modest. By 1928, the party won less than 3% of the vote. For a time, it seemed Hitler might fade into obscurity, another radical in a crowded field. But history was not finished with Germany. In October 1929, Wall Street crashed, global markets convulsed. In Germany, foreign loans evaporated, unemployment soared, soup kitchens filled. The Republic trembled once more, and with it, Hitler's movement was reborn. By the early 1930s, Nazi rallies drew tens of thousands. Brown shirts paraded in cities. The swastika became a national symbol of defiance. The myth Hitler had cultivated since the early 1920s, the promise to avenge Versailles, to restore pride, to crush enemies, now found millions ready to believe. The failed artist from Austria had transformed into a figure of destiny. His blend of fury and vision, spectacle and violence was no longer fringe. It was becoming mainstream. The question loomed, with Germany collapsing once again, would Hitler seize not just a hall or a city, but the nation itself? Crash and opportunity, October 1929. In New York, the stock market collapsed. In Germany, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The Weimar Republic had stabilized only by borrowing heavily from American lenders. When credit dried up, Germany's fragile prosperity disintegrated. By 1932, unemployment soared above 6 million. 1 in 3 Germans was out of work. Cities filled with desperate men selling family heirlooms on street corners. In Berlin, families scavenged through refuse for scraps of coal. Farmers, unable to sell crops at viable prices, watched their land seized by banks. Hunger spread like a shadow over the Republic. It was not merely economic despair. It was dignity stripped bare. Middle-class savings evaporated. Retirees begged in the streets. University graduates drove taxis or roamed unemployed. The Weimar government, mired in parliamentary paralysis, seemed powerless. Each chancellor promised relief. Each failed. In such voids, extremism thrives. The Nazi Party offered clarity in chaos. They spoke of scapegoats, communists conspiring with Moscow, Jews controlling finance, weak politicians betraying the nation. Their message was simple, emotional, direct. Joseph Goebbels perfected the art of amplification. Posters blared slogans of strength. Loudspeakers carried Hitler's voice into towns. Film reels showed the Führer's profile illuminated in torchlight. The swastika, stark, geometric, became omnipresent. The party promised work for the unemployed, protection for farmers, and revival for veterans. To industrialists, Nazis whispered of stability and defense against communism. To the masses, they offered bread and pride. Meanwhile, the rival Communist Party promised revolution. Street battles erupted between brown shirts and red front fighters. Police stations overflowed with the wounded. For ordinary Germans, democracy came to mean violence without end. The numbers told the story. In 1928, Nazis had secured less than 3% of the vote. By July 1932, they commanded 37%, the largest party in the Reichstag. Yet victory was incomplete. No party held a majority. Coalitions fractured. President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging field marshal, loathed Hitler and refused to appoint him chancellor. Instead, backroom intrigues cycled through governments led by Franz von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher. Each fell quickly. Parliamentary democracy looked increasingly absurd. Weak men trading offices while unemployment deepened and violence spread. Hitler, meanwhile, played a longer game. He portrayed himself as the only figure who could unite Germany, avenge Versailles, and restore order. Would the establishment contain him or invite him into power in a desperate bid for stability? That question loomed as Germany slid toward 1933. Seizure of power on January 30th, 1933. After years of stalemate, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. The plan of conservative elites was clear. Harness his popularity, control him from above, and stabilize the Republic. They believed they had tamed him. They had not. Within weeks, Hitler and his allies began dismantling democracy. The Reichstag fire of February 27th provided the first pretext. Flames engulfed the Parliament building. A Dutch communist was arrested, but the origins remain debated to this day. What mattered was consequence. Hitler demanded emergency powers. Hindenburg signed the Reichstag fire decree, suspending freedoms of speech, press, and assembly. Thousands of communists, socialists, and dissidents were arrested. Newspapers closed. Fear spread as neighbors vanished overnight. In March, the Reichstag met in the Kroll Opera House under intimidating rows of SA troops. There, deputies voted on the Enabling Act, granting Hitler authority to legislate without parliament. The Catholic Centre Party, swayed by promises of protection, voted yes. Only Social Democrats resisted. The act passed. Democracy was finished. Hitler moved swiftly. Trade unions were abolished, replaced by the German Labour Front. Political parties dissolved or were banned. Federal states lost autonomy. By summer 1933, Germany was a one-party dictatorship. Opposition did not vanish in silence. Early camps like Dachau opened to hold political prisoners. Uniformed guards patrolled barbed wire perimeters. The machinery of terror began to hum, and yet many Germans welcomed change. Unemployment appeared to decline as public works projects began. Spectacle filled the streets. Torchlight parades, marches, and orchestrated festivals promising unity. For the weary, chaos seemed to have ended. The contradictions were striking. Germany had been promised order, and it came, delivered through fear and fervor alike. But could terror and spectacle sustain legitimacy? Or had Hitler, within months, set Germany irreversibly on the road to dictatorship and war? The machinery of control, the consolidation of power was not a single act but a system. From 1933 onward, the Nazis constructed a machinery of control, part terror, part seduction. The SS, once Hitler's bodyguard unit under Heinrich Himmler, expanded into a vast security apparatus. Its black uniforms, death's head insignia, and rigid discipline made it elite, feared, and fanatical. Beneath it, the Gestapo, the secret police, operated not with vast numbers, but through fear and denunciation. Citizens reported neighbors, co-workers, even family. Silence became safety. Children were not spared. The Hitler Youth indoctrinated boys with paramilitary drills, girls in the League of German Girls with domestic nationalist ideals. Loyalty was drilled through song, ritual, and oaths to Hitler himself. By the late 1930s, participation was nearly universal. But coercion was not the whole story. The regime offered incentives. Autobahn construction employed thousands. Rearmament factories revived industry. The Strength Through Joy program organized vacations, concerts, and sports for workers. The promise of a Volkswagen, a people's car, symbolized prosperity within reach. Propaganda bound all this together. Joseph Goebbels orchestrated a cultural revolution. Newspapers, radio, cinema, all carried a single message of unity, destiny, and racial purity. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will immortalized Nuremberg rallies as political liturgy, with Hitler at their center as almost divine, and yet exclusion deepened. Jews were driven from professions. Dissenters were jailed. Homosexuals, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses faced persecution. Ordinary Germans, meanwhile, adjusted daily life to the new order, often willingly, sometimes fearfully. The machinery appeared flawless. Terror for the few, rewards for the many, spectacle for all. It created the illusion of stability, even rebirth. But illusions carry cracks. Could a regime built on coercion and myth endure indefinitely? Or would its very mechanisms of control lead Germany not to stability, but to catastrophic expansion and genocide? The answer would unfold in the next chapter, as ideology turned outward and persecution intensified. War on the Jews' Germany in 1933 was home to over 500,000 Jews. They were doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, veterans of the Great War. Many saw themselves as thoroughly German, loyal citizens woven into the fabric of national life. Yet to the Nazi worldview, Jews were not neighbors or compatriots. They were outsiders, scapegoats, the embodiment of betrayal. From the moment Hitler seized power, the war on the Jews began, not with mass murder, but with laws, humiliation, and exclusion. The first blows came swiftly. On April 1, 1933, Nazi stormtroopers stood outside Jewish shops, daubing Stars of David on windows, intimidating customers. A nationwide boycott had begun. Weeks later, laws expelled Jewish teachers, civil servants, and judges. Professors lost chairs, scientists lost laboratories. The Republic's universities, once proud beacons of learning, fell silent as Jewish voices were removed. The campaign crystallized in 1935 with the Nuremberg laws. Jews were stripped of citizenship. They could no longer vote, marry non-Jews, or hold public office. Bureaucrats demanded ancestral charts proving Aryan lineage. Mixed families faced shunning, children taunted in schoolyards. Identity itself became legislated. Your blood defined your fate. Ordinary life narrowed. A Jewish doctor in Frankfurt could no longer treat his longtime patients. A Jewish lawyer in Munich could no longer stand before a court. Shops were vandalized, synagogues surveilled. Each decree eroded dignity, yet some still clung to optimism. Many thought the fever would pass, that moderation would return. They underestimated how completely hatred had been woven into the state's fabric. Propaganda sharpened the assault. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda flooded Germany with grotesque images portraying Jews as parasites, criminals, conspirators. Films like Der ewige Jude equated Jewish life with vermin, contrasting it with Nazi ideals of health and strength. Such messages were not only top-down. Schoolchildren were taught racial science. Textbooks carried diagrams of skulls, lessons on blood purity. Teachers singled out Jewish classmates, pointing to them as examples of undesirable traits. Indoctrination spread prejudice into daily rituals, ensuring the next generation absorbed hate as natural truth. But hatred would soon leave classrooms and enter the streets in flames. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. November 9th to 10, 1938, a state-sanctioned pogrom swept across Germany and Austria. Synagogues burned, their interiors gutted by fire brigades that stood by to protect surrounding non-Jewish property. Shop windows shattered, Torah scrolls were desecrated. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested, dragged to concentration camps. Hundreds were killed, many more terrorized. The message was clear. There was no longer safety, not even in one's home or neighborhood. For many Jews, Kristallnacht was the turning point. Emigration became desperate priority. Families queued outside embassies, pleading for visas, yet doors closed. The United States enforced strict quotas. Britain admitted children in the Kindertransport, but limited adults. Palestine remained restricted. Refugees boarded ships like the St. Louis, only to be turned back from American and Cuban shores. Escape routes dwindled. Trapped, German Jews faced an accelerating nightmare. Everyday life grew suffocating. Jews were banned from parks, cinemas, even park benches. Radios were confiscated, telephones restricted. Curfews confined families indoors after dark. Bank accounts were seized. Children were expelled from public schools. Even pets were sometimes forbidden. Imagine a shopkeeper in Leipzig. His license revoked, shelves empty, customers gone. His wife trades heirlooms for food. His son mocked by classmates in the street. The walls close in, day by day. Survival narrows to endurance. And yet, many still tried to live, celebrating Passover, playing music, writing diaries. In defiance of dehumanization, life persisted. But survival was becoming contingent not on law, but on geography. As Hitler expanded without war into Austria, into Czechoslovakia, the Jewish population under Nazi rule swelled. Each annexation brought new victims into the system. In Vienna, jubilant crowds cheered Hitler, while Jews were forced to scrub streets with toothbrushes under jeers. In Prague, Jewish professionals saw their offices sealed, their libraries looted. Anti-Jewish decrees spread outward like contagion, replicating across conquered lands. The war on Jews was not confined to Germany. It was exported. Yet in 1939, as Germany prepared for war, the world still misunderstood the depth of Nazi intent. Many assumed persecution might push Jews to leave, that violence would remain limited to humiliation and property seizure. Few grasped that the groundwork for annihilation was already laid. The ghettos, the camps, the trains, these had not yet been fully constructed, but the ideology was clear. The propaganda had saturated. The legal exclusion was complete. The social isolation was near total. The question remained, with war as cover, what new horrors would unfold? The war on Jews in the 1930s was not spontaneous violence. It was systematic, step by step, law by law, insult by insult, night by night. It transformed neighbors into enemies, citizens into outcasts, lives into statistics. Germany had crossed a threshold. Persecution had become policy. Hate had become law. What began with boycotts and decrees was about to escalate into something the world had never seen before. The industrialized murder of millions to expansion. Without war, in March 1936, German soldiers marched into the Rhineland. According to the Treaty of Versailles, and later the Locarno Pact, this western strip of territory was to remain free of troops. It was a security buffer for France, a symbol of German defeat. Hitler chose to break the rules. The risk was enormous. Germany's army was small, ill-equipped, scarcely ready for war. Hitler admitted that if France had resisted, he would have ordered retreat. But France, fractured by political division, did not act. Britain, seeking peace, called it Germany's backyard. This bloodless gamble paid off spectacularly. Crowds cheered in Cologne as soldiers paraded beneath swastikas. The Reich had regained lost ground, not through battle, but through audacity. It was a rehearsal for bigger moves to come. 2 years later, Hitler's ambitions turned south. Austria, his birthplace, had long been a dream for union. An Anschluss. Nazi influence had grown inside the country, feeding on instability. In March 1938, Hitler demanded annexation. When Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg tried to call a referendum, Hitler sent an ultimatum. Under pressure, Schuschnigg resigned. German troops rolled across the border unopposed. In Vienna, jubilant crowds greeted them. The Anschluss was presented as voluntary, a uniting of German-speaking peoples. In reality, it was conquest disguised as destiny. Austria ceased to exist. Its Jewish community, 200,000 strong, was subjected overnight to humiliation, forced to scrub streets, their businesses seized. For Germany, annexation brought resources, manpower and psychological momentum. For Hitler, it confirmed his conviction. Boldness brought reward. Czechoslovakia was next. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a border region home to ethnic Germans. He claimed their rights were oppressed, their culture denied. In truth, the Sudetenland's industries and fortifications made it strategically vital. Europe faced a crisis. Czechoslovakia was allied to France and the Soviet Union. War seemed possible. Yet in September 1938, leaders met in Munich. Britain's Neville Chamberlain, France's Édouard Daladier, Mussolini and Hitler gathered. Absent were the Czechs themselves. The Munich Agreement ceded the Sudetenland to Germany. Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming, "Peace for our time." Hitler, in triumph, had dismantled Europe's strongest democracy without a single shot. But within months, he broke the promise. In March 1939, German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. It was no longer about ethnic Germans. It was raw expansion. Even appeasers now recognized Hitler's ambition had no limit. While diplomats signed agreements, Germany rearmed at breakneck pace. Rearmament violated Versailles, but by the late 1930s, the Wehrmacht had grown into a formidable force. Panzer divisions, Luftwaffe squadrons, U-boats prowling the seas. Albert Speer and other planners oversaw a war economy, with factories producing tanks and planes instead of consumer goods. Propaganda sold it as revival, masking militarization with the promise of jobs. For workers, paychecks returned. For the regime, a war machine was born. Ordinary Germans felt the benefits. Unemployment plummeted. Farmers saw debts forgiven. Middle-class families joined strength through joy holidays. The regime promised prosperity, but in reality prosperity was tethered to conquest. Expansion was not optional. It was fuel. The international stage emboldened Hitler. Britain and France hesitated, haunted by memories of the last war. Many leaders believed Hitler could be contained, that satisfying territorial demands would restore stability. Others sympathized with his claim that Versailles had been unjust. Yet dissent existed. Winston Churchill warned that appeasement was folly. He declared that Britain had chosen dishonor to avoid war, but would have both dishonor and war. His words would soon prove prophetic. Daily life in Germany mirrored these triumphs. Radio broadcasts trumpeted victories. Newspapers hailed Hitler as a genius. Parades filled streets. Festivals staged in towns to celebrate reunification of the Reich. But alongside jubilation lay shadows. Jews in annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia were stripped of livelihoods. Resistance voices vanished. Dissenting Germans faced the Gestapo's knock. Ordinary citizens lived between celebration and surveillance, pride and fear. The paradox was stark. Expansion seemed bloodless to the world, yet violence against minorities was already sharpening. By 1939, Hitler's sights shifted to Poland. He claimed German minorities there were oppressed. Demands escalated for the free city of Danzig. This time, Britain and France drew a line. They pledged to defend Polish sovereignty. The stage was set. Expansion without war had reached its limit. The next step would ignite the conflict Germany claimed to dread, but secretly prepared to unleash. The Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, each conquest without resistance, each triumph feeding the myth of destiny, each gamble raising the stakes. But could Hitler's audacity continue unchecked? Or had Germany's expansion now crossed the threshold from diplomacy to inevitable war? The answer would come in September 1939. Blitzkrieg Unleashed, September 1, 1939. At 4:45 a.m., without declaration, German forces invaded Poland. Within minutes, the world's balance shifted from uneasy peace to total war. The assault was unlike anything Europe had witnessed. Waves of aircraft struck Polish rail lines, bridges, and airfields, crippling infrastructure before defenders could react. On the ground, panzer divisions, sleek tanks supported by mechanized infantry, punched through at weak points. Radios crackled orders. Motorized columns raced ahead, bypassing strongholds, encircling entire armies. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war. A synthesis of speed, surprise, and coordination. In weeks, the Polish state unraveled. By September 17th, the invasion became a partition. The Soviet Union, bound by the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, entered from the east. Between them, Nazi Germany and the USSR erased Poland from the map. Warsaw fell by September's end. In less than a month, a nation of 35 million had been crushed. For Hitler, the gamble paid off. Britain and France declared war on Germany, yet no immediate offensive followed in the West. The period became known as the Phony War. But in the East, Poland's agony was real. Elites executed, Jewish populations forced into ghettos, cultural institutions dismantled. Had Blitzkrieg revealed a new art of war, one unstoppable, or would its brilliance falter against stronger foes? The answer came swiftly. In April 1940, Germany struck Denmark and Norway. Denmark collapsed in hours. Its king ordered no resistance. Norway fought longer, but fell within weeks. Germany now controlled vital Atlantic ports and iron ore supplies from Scandinavia. Then, in May, Hitler turned west. French strategists had relied on the Maginot Line, a fortress chain guarding their frontier, but German panzers, massed under generals like Heinz Guderian, drove through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French deemed impassable. Within days, German armour emerged behind Allied lines, severing supply routes, encircling entire divisions. The Blitzkrieg struck not just with steel, but with shock. Communications collapsed, refugees clogged roads mixing with retreating armies. Entire towns emptied overnight. By late May, British and French troops were trapped at Dunkirk. Under constant bombardment, an improvised flotilla of naval and civilian vessels evacuated over 300,000 soldiers. The miracle of Dunkirk saved Britain's army, but left its heavy weapons behind. Paris fell on June 14th. Within weeks, France surrendered. The once proud French army, expected to resist for years, collapsed in mere 6 weeks. Europe was stunned. Blitzkrieg seemed invincible. Nazi flags flew over the Eiffel Tower. Hitler paraded in Paris, triumphant. At home, victory was intoxicating. Newspapers hailed Hitler as military genius. Citizens celebrated parades, ration cards suddenly redeemed with spoils from conquered lands. Soldiers sent postcards from Paris, Copenhagen, Brussels, souvenirs of conquest. But beneath triumph lay darkness. In occupied Poland, repression deepened. Jewish ghettos in Warsaw and Lodz swelled with starvation and disease. Polish elites were executed at sites like Palmyry. In Norway and France, collaborators emerged, but so did resistance movements, laying seeds for future struggle. For occupied peoples, Blitzkrieg meant not just swift defeat, but years of subjugation. Yet one opponent remained unconquered: Britain. Hitler hoped for negotiation after France's fall. Instead, Winston Churchill declared defiance. "We shall fight on the beaches." Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, depended on control of the skies. The Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain in summer 1940. Dogfights raged above English fields. London endured the Blitz, nightly bombing raids that reduced neighbourhoods to rubble, families huddling in underground stations. Despite devastation, Britain did not yield. The Royal Air Force, aided by radar and home advantage, held firm. By October, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. Blitzkrieg had met its first barrier. Still, expansion continued elsewhere. In spring 1941, German forces swept into Yugoslavia and Greece, overrunning both in weeks. North Africa became a theatre, with Rommel's Africa Corps duelling the British. By mid-1941, Nazi Germany commanded an empire from the Atlantic to the Balkans. Blitzkrieg had reshaped Europe in less than 2 years. But speed had costs. Conquests stretched supply lines, overtaxed logistics, and concealed vulnerabilities. Victories encouraged risk. Hitler began to believe his armies were unstoppable. The question now: where would lightning strike next? The answer lay in the east. Hitler's gaze fixed on the Soviet Union. In his mind, conquest of living space was destiny. The next campaign would dwarf all before it. Blitzkrieg would expand into a continent-wide crusade, and its limits, military, moral, human, would be tested to destruction. Fortress Europe. By the summer of 1941, Hitler's empire seemed unassailable. From Norway's icy fjords to Greece's sunlit ruins, Nazi Germany controlled Europe's core. Neutral nations, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, sat on the periphery, cautious and constrained. Allies and satellites, Italy, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, gravitated toward Berlin's orbit. It was a continent reshaped. Newspapers spoke of the New Order. Propaganda depicted a harmonious Europe under German guidance. In reality, Fortress Europe was built on exploitation, repression, and fear. Every occupied land became a resource. Crops, minerals, and industry were requisitioned. Millions were conscripted into forced labor, shipped to German factories. Young men from Poland, Ukraine, and France worked under guard, often housed in barracks ringed with barbed wire. Families at home survived on ration cards, watching food siphoned away to the Reich. Was this empire sustainable? Or was it already creaking under its own contradictions? Collaboration varied. In France, the Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain administered the unoccupied South, presenting itself as guardian of French tradition. In reality, it enacted German orders, including anti-Jewish legislation. In Norway, Vidkun Quisling's puppet government became synonymous with treason. Across Eastern Europe, local police often cooperated with German occupiers in rounding up Jews and dissidents, yet collaboration was never universal. Resistance stirred. In the forests of Poland, partisans ambushed convoys. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans waged guerrilla war. In France, underground newspapers spread defiance, and rail workers sabotaged supply lines. The Reich responded with terror. For every German killed, civilians were executed in reprisal. Villages like Lidis in Czechoslovakia were obliterated, their inhabitants murdered or deported. Fear was intended as deterrence, but it often fueled further defiance. In cities, occupation altered daily rhythms. Curfews silenced nightlife. Queues formed outside bakeries, ration tickets in hand. Black markets thrived. Coffee in Paris, cigarettes in Amsterdam, bread in Warsaw. Families listened secretly to BBC broadcasts, risking arrest. For some, survival meant accommodation, working in German factories, joining collaborationist militias, keeping heads down. For others, survival meant resistance in whispers, in coded letters, in hidden rooms. Jews across occupied Europe were increasingly marked for persecution. Yellow stars, property seizures, deportations, ghettos swelled in Warsaw, Vilnius and Riga. Fortress Europe was not merely military, it was ideological. Hitler's vision required subjugation of peoples deemed inferior, clearing space for German settlers in the east. Militarily, Fortress Europe meant fortification. Along the Atlantic coast, engineers built concrete bunkers, artillery emplacements, and minefields, the Atlantic Wall. From the Bay of Biscay to the cliffs of Norway, defences were meant to deter invasion. Yet these defences reflected fear. Hitler knew Britain, backed by American industry and empire, remained defiant. Across the Channel, Allied bombers struck German cities, their raids intensifying by 1942. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, once industrial powerhouses, became smoking ruins. Civilians slept in basements, families buried under rubble. Even in triumph, Fortress Europe was under siege. Hitler spoke of unity, but cracks widened. The Italian army faltered in North Africa and Greece, forcing German rescue. Romania and Hungary provided oil and troops but demanded influence. Rivalries between Nazi officials, Himmler's SS, Göring's Luftwaffe, Speer's armaments ministry, bred inefficiency. The empire was not a monolith. It was a patchwork of ambition and rivalry. Still, the illusion of strength persisted. Germany appeared invincible, its borders secure, its economy fueled by plunder. But could conquest alone sustain empire? Or would the weight of repression and resistance erode the Reich from within? Beyond Fortress Europe, enemies gathered. The United States, though not yet at war, armed Britain through Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union, bound by a fragile pact, eyed Germany warily. By late 1941, Hitler prepared his greatest gamble yet, the invasion of the East. Fortress Europe was never meant to be defensive. It was staging ground. Hitler believed the Reich's destiny lay in conquering the Soviet Union. The new order was not complete without Lebensraum. For now, Fortress Europe seemed impregnable, but beneath its surface lay resistance, exploitation, and the stirrings of overreach. The question loomed, could Hitler's empire endure as fortress, or was it only a prelude to the greatest and deadliest offensive in history? The answer would come in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa 8, first light on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in history began. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 500,000 Axis allies, stormed across an 1,800-mile front into the Soviet Union. It was Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's crusade for Lebensraum, living space, and racial conquest. The scale defied comprehension. 3 army groups, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and over 2,500 aircraft. Hitler described it as a clash of civilizations. Germany against Judeo-Bolshevism. For the Wehrmacht, it was a campaign of annihilation. Would lightning war succeed against a continent-sized foe? Or had Hitler's gamble already overreached? The opening weeks seemed to vindicate German confidence. The Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many still on the ground. Blitzkrieg's momentum carried armoured spearheads deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies. By July, Minsk and Smolensk had fallen, with hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers captured. But this was no ordinary war. Orders from Berlin demanded not just victory but extermination. Kommissar Order authorized execution of captured political officers. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the armies, massacring Jews, communists, and civilians. Villages were burned, populations terrorized. This was not strategy alone. It was ideology made flesh. Army Group North swept toward Leningrad, initiating what would become a siege lasting 872 days. Army Group South drove into Ukraine, capturing Kiev in September with over 600,000 Soviet prisoners, the largest encirclement in history. Grain fields and oil reserves promised resources for the Reich. At the center, the road to Moscow beckoned. By October, German forces stood within 200 miles of the Soviet capital. The city prepared for battle. Trenches dug by civilians, factories dismantled, and moved east beyond the Urals. Could Moscow fall before winter? Nature intervened. The Rasputitsa, Russia's autumn rains, turned roads into rivers of mud. Panzers stalled, trucks abandoned. Soldiers marched knee-deep in mire, horses collapsed in exhaustion. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, vulnerable to partisans and overuse. When the cold came in November, it was catastrophic. Temperatures plunged below 30 degrees. Engines froze, weapons jammed, men wrapped rags around feet in place of boots. Frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. For an army built on speed, the freeze was fatal. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army struck back. Reinforcements from Siberia, battle-hardened, winter-equipped, launched a counter-offensive outside Moscow. The German advance halted. Units reeled backward. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht retreated in defeat. Hitler refused to allow withdrawal, issuing stand-fast orders that condemned divisions to destruction. His belief in willpower over strategy cost lives, eroded confidence, and exposed the limits of his command. The myth of invincibility cracked in the snow outside Moscow. Behind the front, atrocities escalated. Einsatzgruppen massacred Jews in mass shootings at ravines like Babi Yar near Kiev, where over 33,000 were killed in 2 days. Entire communities vanished. The invasion had become both a military campaign and the opening act of the Holocaust. Civilians endured horror. Cities were razed, villages depopulated, millions conscripted into forced labor. Hunger stalked the occupied territories. In Leningrad, besieged by Army Group North, 1 million civilians would perish from starvation, disease, and bombardment. Barbarossa was more than war. It was genocide unleashed under cover of conquest. Yet in Berlin, Hitler framed the invasion as destiny. Propaganda hailed victories, ignored setbacks, and promised final collapse of the Soviet colossus. Goebbels broadcast images of jubilant soldiers, grain trains rolling west, Soviet prisoners trudging into camps. But reality could not be hidden indefinitely. By early 1942, German soldiers wrote letters home describing misery, cold, and endless resistance. Families began to grasp that the war would not be short, nor easy. The gamble had failed. The Soviet Union, far from collapsing, was mobilizing on a scale Germany could not match. Soviet industry, relocated east, churned out T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers. Millions of new soldiers joined the Red Army. For every loss, replacements arrived. Germany, meanwhile, had no such reserves. Blitzkrieg had struck hard, but not fatally. The Reich now faced a war of attrition, a struggle it could not afford. Barbarossa, envisioned as quick victory, became the turning point. Operation Barbarossa opened with lightning and fire. It promised empire, resources, and racial conquest. Instead, it brought stalemate, overextension, and the seeds of defeat. The question was no longer whether Germany could win quickly. It was whether Germany could survive the war it had unleashed. The answer would unfold on battlefields from Stalingrad to Kursk, where the tide of history would turn. The Holocaust begins. The Nazi war on the Jews did not begin with the gas chambers. It began with ghettos, mass shootings, and starvation. The invasion of Poland in 1939 placed over 3 million Jews under Nazi rule. Here, Hitler's ideology became practice. In each, German authorities forced Jews into confined districts. Families were herded into overcrowded ghettos, walls built, gates locked. In Warsaw, 400,000 people were crammed into 1.3 square miles. Food rations were deliberately meager, 184 calories a day per Jew, compared to 2,400 for Germans. Hunger gnawed. Children slipped through cracks to smuggle bread, risking death. Life shrank to survival. Schools closed. Markets vanished. Music, theatre, and underground newspapers persisted. fragile acts of defiance. Diaries, like that of teenager Chaim Kaplan, recorded starvation, disease, and despair. "We are cut off from the world," he wrote, "left to perish slowly." In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa carried Nazi ideology eastward. Behind the Wehrmacht, Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units fanned out. Their orders: eliminate Jews, communist partisans. In towns and villages from Lithuania to Ukraine, Jews were rounded up, marched to pits, and shot. At Babi Yar, outside Kiev, 33,771 Jews were murdered in 2 days. Similar massacres unfolded in Riga, Minsk, Kaunas. Men, women, children, all executed in ravines and forests. These were crimes carried out in public view. Local collaborators sometimes participated. Neighbors watched. Fear mingled with silence. Some resisted, but most remained passive, powerless, or complicit. By the end of 1941, hundreds of thousands had been slaughtered. The killings had already begun. But in January 1942, Nazi leaders convened at Wannsee, a villa outside Berlin. Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann presented the final solution to the Jewish question. Deportation and extermination were now organized policy. The scope was staggering. Jews not only in Germany and occupied Poland, but across Europe, France, the Netherlands, Greece, Italy. Bureaucrats, lawyers, SS officers agreed on logistics: transport by rail, camps for labor, camps for death. Genocide became systematic. Trains became instruments of murder. Cattle cars, crammed with families, departed daily. Inside, passengers suffocated, starved, or froze. Survivors arrived at camps like Chelmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. There, deception reigned. Victims were told they were to be resettled. Showers awaited. Instead, gas chambers disguised as bathhouses consumed thousands at a time. Zyklon B pellets, once an insecticide, became a weapon of extermination. Bodies were burned in crematoria or open pits, ash scattered in rivers and fields. Every item was looted: gold teeth, hair, clothing. German industry profited from plunder. The killing was industrial, impersonal, genocide by assembly line. Yet amid annihilation, fragments of resistance emerged. In Warsaw's ghetto, armed groups smuggled weapons, planning uprising. In Treblinka and Sobibor, prisoners staged revolts, some escaping into forests. In Vilnius, partisans fought with stolen rifles. For many, resistance meant documenting truth. Ringelblum's underground archive in Warsaw buried testimonies, discovered only after the war. Poets scribbled verses, rabbis held secret prayers. In the face of dehumanization, humanity endured. But resistance rarely slowed the machinery. By 1943, most Polish ghettos had been liquidated. By 1944, trains from across Europe, France, Hungary, Greece, fed Auschwitz daily. Upon arrival, selections decided fate. The young and strong were sent to forced labor, building factories, mining coal, producing arms. The elderly, children, the weak, were sent directly to gas chambers. Families were torn apart in minutes. In labor camps, survival meant enduring starvation rations, beatings, and disease. Prisoners built roads, dug tunnels, assembled weapons for the very regime enslaving them. Mortality was staggering. Some Germans knew. Letters from soldiers described shootings. Civilians living near camps smelled smoke, saw ash. Rumors spread across occupied Europe. Yet many remained silent, unable or unwilling to confront reality. By 1942-43, reports of mass killings reached the Allies. Underground couriers delivered testimonies, photographs, pleas, but disbelief, bureaucratic caution, and wartime priorities slowed response. The war remained the focus. Rescue, limited and rare. For the victims, there was little help. Europe's Jews stood alone, caught in the gears of genocide. The Holocaust was not merely German policy. It was European tragedy. From Amsterdam to Salonika, Jews were deported. Communities centuries old vanished in months. Ladino songs silenced in Greece. Yiddish theatres dark in Poland. Synagogues gutted across the continent. 6 million Jews were murdered. Alongside them, Roma, disabled, homosexuals, and political prisoners suffered persecution and death. The Holocaust began as exclusion, deepened into segregation, and culminated in mechanized extermination. It revealed how ideology, bureaucracy, and technology could converge to destroy entire peoples. But even amid annihilation, testimony endured. Scraps of diaries, fragments of prayer, whispered stories that would survive. The Reich sought to erase, but memory resisted. As 1943 dawned, Germany still held the continent in its grip. Yet on the Eastern Front, the tide of war was turning. The same winter that brought Soviet counterattack at Stalingrad also marked the point where Hitler's empire began to fracture. Could a regime committing genocide on this scale also hope to win a world war? The answer lay in battles yet to come. War turns against the Reich by 1942. Hitler's armies dominated Europe. From the Atlantic to the Caucasus, the Reich seemed unstoppable. Yet beneath triumph, cracks widened. The vast Soviet Union had not collapsed. Britain still stood defiant. And now, the United States had entered the war. The turning of the tide would begin in the east, on the banks of the Volga River. In summer 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive, Operation Blue. The goal was oil. Germany's war machine ran on fuel, and the Caucasus promised vast reserves. Army Group. South swept across Ukraine, splitting toward the Caucasus Mountains and Stalingrad. Stalingrad, an industrial city of 500,000, became symbolic. To Stalin, it bore his name. To Hitler, its capture would humiliate his enemy. The battle began in August. The Luftwaffe reduced the city to rubble. Yet the ruins favored defenders. Soviet troops clung to every street, every basement. Fighting became house to house, room to room. Snipers stalked across debris. Grain elevators, factories, and sewers turned into fortresses. German soldiers called it the Rattenkrieg, Rat War. By autumn, the Germans controlled most of the city. Yet the Soviets never surrendered. Reinforcements crossed the Volga under fire, ferried by barges through icy waters. Civilians dug trenches. Women hauled ammunition. Children worked as medics. Then in November 1942, the Red Army struck. Operation Uranus, massive counteroffensives north and south of Stalingrad, encircled the German Sixth Army. Nearly 300,000 soldiers trapped. Supplies dwindled. Hunger and frostbite consumed men as Soviet lines tightened. Hitler forbade retreat. He declared Sixth Army would hold. Air resupply failed. By February 1943, starvation and ammunition exhaustion forced surrender. The defeat was catastrophic. Nearly 100,000 German survivors marched into Soviet captivity. Only a fraction would return years later. The myth of Nazi invincibility was broken. At the same time, the Axis suffered setbacks elsewhere. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps had advanced to El Alamein in Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal. But in October 1942, British forces under Bernard Montgomery counterattacked. The Battle of El Alamein pushed Rommel back. Soon after, American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch. German forces were trapped between advancing allies from the west and the British from the east. By May 1943, Axis troops in North Africa surrendered. Over 250,000 men lost. The Mediterranean lay open. Meanwhile, the skies above Germany filled with fire. British and American bombers launched devastating raids. Cologne, Essen, and Hamburg endured firestorms that incinerated tens of thousands. Factories were crippled, transport disrupted, civilians huddled in bunkers, emerging to landscapes of ash. The air war brought suffering home. Families dug relatives from rubble, ration lines lengthened, children evacuated. Yet propaganda urged resilience. Bombs cannot break us. Still, the cost mounted. Ordinary Germans began to question whether Hitler's promise of victory was illusion. Amid war, resistance flickered. The White Rose, a group of students led by Hans and Sophie Scholl, distributed leaflets denouncing Nazi crimes. They were arrested, tried, and executed by guillotine. Their courage inspired whispers of defiance, but revealed the cost of dissent. Even within the army, doubts grew. Some officers began plotting against Hitler, believing he was leading Germany to ruin. The July 20th plot of 1944 lay ahead, but its seeds were already planted. By 1943, the Eastern Front became a cauldron. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht attempted to regain initiative. In July, they launched Operation Citadel, aimed at the Kursk salient. It became the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of panzers, including new Tiger and Panther models, faced Soviet T-34s. The battle raged across minefields and fields of fire. But the Soviets, forewarned, had fortified extensively. German assaults faltered. By August, the Red Army counterattacked, driving westward. The momentum shifted irreversibly. Globally, the Allies coordinated. In Tehran, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, planned future offensives, including a cross-channel invasion. American industry poured out tanks, aircraft, and ships at unparalleled scale. The Soviet Union fielded millions. Britain endured and adapted. Germany, by contrast, bled resources. Casualties soared. Fuel shortages deepened. Its allies, Italy, Hungary, Romania, wavered. For civilians in the Reich, daily life deteriorated. Food rationing tightened. Women worked in armaments factories. Foreign forced laborers filled fields and workshops. Bombing raids shattered sleep. The promise of prosperity had vanished. The 1,000-year Reich looked increasingly fragile. The Reich that had once expanded at lightning speed now fought desperate retreats. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces pressed inexorably westward. In Italy, Mussolini was overthrown. German troops occupied the peninsula to keep it in the war. For Hitler, denial replaced strategy. He demanded stand-fast orders, sacrificing divisions to encirclement. Generals who questioned him were dismissed. Ideology overruled pragmatism. By 1943, the war had turned. Stalingrad, El Alamein, Kursk, Allied bombing, all signaled reversal. The Reich was not on the road to triumph, but collapse. Yet Hitler refused compromise. He promised new wonder weapons, new victories, total war. His belief in destiny remained unshaken, even as reality crumbled. The question now, how far would Germany go to sustain a war already lost? Total war. Do you want total war? He thundered. The crowd roared back, yes! This was the turning point. After Stalingrad, the illusion of quick victory was gone. Now, Goebbels demanded every man, woman, and child sacrifice everything for the Reich. The 1,000-year Reich had entered its desperate phase. Factories ran around the clock. Women were drafted into munitions plants, welding tanks, and assembling aircraft. Foreign labor. Prisoners of war, civilians from occupied lands, concentration camp inmates were forced into mines, construction, and agriculture. Their rations were meager, conditions brutal, mortality staggering. In the Hitler Youth, boys as young as 12 drilled with rifles, manned anti-aircraft guns, trained for combat. Girls in the League of German Girls were taught to nurse the wounded and bear future soldiers. Childhood was militarized. Life in the Reich grew harsher. Food rations dwindled. Blackouts darkened cities. Families huddled in basements as Allied bombers reduced neighborhoods to rubble. Yet propaganda continued, insisting sacrifice would yield victory. The air war intensified. In July 1943, Operation Gomorrah unleashed a firestorm on Hamburg. Temperatures reached 800 degrees C. Winds sucked people into flames. Over 40,000 civilians perished. Entire districts vanished overnight. Still, the regime insisted Germans endure. Goebbels portrayed victims as martyrs for the Reich, but in private, despair spread. Letters, diaries, and whispers in queues confessed doubt. How long could this continue? Abroad, Germany's allies faltered. Italy collapsed in July 1943. Mussolini was deposed, though later rescued by German commandos. Italy switched sides, joining the Allies. German troops occupied Rome and the north, turning Italy into another front. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin, fought in Russia, Italy, and across the skies. The dream of Fortress Europe was cracking. Resistance at home grew bolder. The July 20, 1944 plot revealed deep disillusion within the officer corps. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb in Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters. The explosion killed 4, but Hitler survived. Reprisals were savage. Over 4,000 suspected conspirators executed. Yet the attempt showed cracks even in the regime's core. Other resistance persisted in small acts. Hiding Jews, circulating banned leaflets, listening to foreign radio. Courageous, but perilous, punishable by imprisonment or death. Then came D-Day. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. American, British, and Canadian troops secured a foothold in France. Despite fierce German defences, the Allies broke through. Paris was liberated by August. In the east, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, annihilating German Army Group Center. The Red Army advanced hundreds of miles, retaking Belarus, pushing into Poland. The Reich now faced enemies converging from both directions. At home, Goebbels doubled down on rhetoric. He promised new wonder weapons, jet fighters, rockets, and secret arms. V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets struck London, terrifying but strategically limited. They could not reverse the tide. For ordinary Germans, survival became daily struggle. Women queued for hours for meager bread. Children orphaned by bombing wandered ruins. Forced laborers toiled under guard. Amid propaganda promises, reality was hunger, rubble, and grief. Yet fanaticism persisted. Hitler demanded unconditional loyalty. SS units hunted deserters. Fear bound the nation as tightly as ideology. By late 1944, the Reich was collapsing, but surrender remained unthinkable. Hitler declared the nation must fight to the last man. The population, he claimed, would either triumph or perish. Germany had entered the abyss of total war. The Reich had gambled everything on speed and victory. Now, with enemies closing in, it demanded total sacrifice from its people. But could fanaticism and desperation stave off defeat, or would total war simply bring total destruction? The answer would emerge in 1945 as the Reich faced collapse. Collapse of the Reich in December 1944. Hitler made one final gamble. The Ardennes offensive, remembered as the Battle of the Bulge, was meant to split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force negotiation. At first, the surprise worked. American units were overwhelmed, towns fell, and German tanks pushed a dangerous bulge into Allied lines. In Bastogne, surrounded US forces held out under siege, supplied only by parachute drops. When asked for surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied, "Nuts." Within weeks, Allied reinforcements counterattacked. Short on fuel, harried by air power, the German offensive collapsed. The Reich had spent its last reserves. By January 1945, the Western Front surged eastward. At the same time, the Red Army launched its massive Vistula-Oder offensive. In weeks, Soviet forces advanced hundreds of miles, overrunning Poland, reaching the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. Along the way, they liberated camps like Auschwitz, uncovering horrors that shocked the world. The liberation revealed the full scale of the Holocaust. Soldiers, hardened by years of war, wept at the evidence of genocide. For the Reich, its greatest crime was now exposed. By 1945, Germany itself was collapsing. Allied bombers reduced cities to ash. Dresden in February became an inferno. Civilians fled west in endless columns, pushing carts, carrying children. Refugees clogged roads as Soviet tanks rolled past. Hunger, cold, and fear consumed the population. The once proud cities of the Reich were now ghostly shells. In Berlin, Hitler retreated underground to the Führer bunker. He raged at generals, dismissed realities, issued impossible orders. He believed new wonder weapons could still turn the tide, or that enemies would fracture. None did. Goebbels, Himmler, Bormann, his inner circle clung to him. But faith was waning. The Reich was unraveling. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen fell intact, allowing armies to pour into Germany's heartland. Town after town surrendered. German civilians hung white sheets from windows. In the east, Soviet troops encircled Berlin by April. The city became a battlefield. Hitler Youth and Volkssturm militia, old men and boys, manned barricades with Panzerfausts. Artillery turned boulevards into wastelands. Civilians cowered in cellars as shells shook the ground. The Third Reich's capital was dying. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, Hitler dictated his final will. He blamed Jews, generals, and betrayal for Germany's ruin. That afternoon, he and Eva Braun, his wife of one day, committed suicide in the bunker. Their bodies were burned in the garden above. Goebbels followed, taking his family with him in poison. Himmler attempted to negotiate with the Allies, but was arrested and killed himself. The Nazi leadership disintegrated in death, capture, or flight. On May 7th at Reims, German representatives signed unconditional surrender. The following day, May 8th, Victory in Europe Day was declared. Crowds erupted in London, Paris, New York, Moscow. Bells rang, flags waved, strangers embraced. In Germany, silence. Cities lay in ruins, millions homeless, millions dead. Survivors emerged from camps. Displaced persons wandered roads. The Reich had lasted 12 years. Its destruction was near total. The Reich's collapse was both physical and moral. Cities destroyed, armies annihilated, ideology discredited. Yet scars would linger in survivors' memories, in shattered families, in the geopolitical order to come. The war that Hitler began to dominate Europe had instead destroyed Germany itself. The collapse of the Reich was not only the fall of a regime, it was the consequence of total war, of ideology turned into empire, of ambition collapsing into ruin. But how would the world reckon with crimes on such scale? Could justice ever balance the weight of atrocity? The answer would come at Nuremberg. Legacies and lessons, the war was over, the Reich lay in ashes. But the world faced a question without precedent. How to reckon with crimes so vast, so deliberate, so systematic? The answer began at Nuremberg. In November 1945, representatives of the victorious Allies convened the International Military Tribunal. 24 senior Nazi leaders stood accused of crimes against peace, war crimes, and newly defined crimes against humanity. Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel. Names once feared across Europe now sat in silence as evidence was read. Films of camps, photographs of massacres, testimony of survivors revealed atrocities in irrefutable detail. For the first time in history, leaders were held accountable not merely for defeat, but for genocide. Sentences varied: death by hanging for many, prison for others. The trials established a precedent. There could be no impunity for crimes against humanity. Beyond courtrooms, survivors faced the task of rebuilding lives. Millions displaced, Jews, forced laborers, prisoners of war, waited in camps for resettlement. Some returned to ruined homes. Others emigrated to Palestine, the United States, or new communities abroad. The trauma lingered, families destroyed, traditions shattered, memories unbearable. Yet resilience emerged. Synagogues reopened, survivors married, children were born. Amid devastation, life began again. Germany itself was transformed. Occupied by allies, the nation split into zones. Denazification programs aimed to purge Nazi influence. Leaders were removed, symbols banned, education rewritten. Yet the process was uneven. Some perpetrators escaped justice, others reintegrated quietly. In 1949, Germany divided. The Federal Republic in the West aligned with the United States. The German Democratic Republic in the East aligned with the Soviet Union. The Cold War was born out of the ashes of the Reich. Memory became a battleground. Survivors preserved testimony through diaries, films, museums. Israel's founding in 1948 was both refuge and response, a homeland forged in the shadow of genocide. In Europe, memorials rose slowly, often contested, as nations struggled with guilt, denial, or silence. But over time, remembrance deepened. The word Holocaust entered global consciousness. The cry of never again became both vow and warning. The legacies of Nazi Germany shaped international law. The Genocide Convention of 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and later tribunals for crimes in Rwanda and the Balkans all drew lineage from Nuremberg. Yet memory is not static. Symbols outlawed in Germany resurfaced in extremist movements worldwide. Ideologies of hate adapted, finding new voices. The lessons of history remain urgent, unfinished. Modern Germany stands as a paradox. Once epicenter of destruction, now a democracy committed to remembrance. The scars remain visible, memorials in stone, exhibitions in ruins, silence in forests where massacres occurred. Yet the nation rebuilt itself as a pillar of Europe, bound by commitment to never repeat its darkest past. The echoes of the Reich ripple outward still. They remind us of the fragility of institutions, the seduction of propaganda, the danger of scapegoating. The story of Nazi Germany is not simply the tale of one man's rise and fall, nor only of battles won and lost. It is a warning of how democracies can crumble, how fear can be weaponized, how ordinary people can be complicit in extraordinary crimes. It is also a testament to resilience, to remembrance, to the enduring struggle to uphold humanity. The Reich collapsed in 1945, but its legacies remain with us, in law, in memory, in vigilance. The lessons endure because the questions endure. How do we guard against tyranny? How do we confront hate before it metastasizes? And how do we honor the millions who perished by ensuring history is neither forgotten nor repeated? This is the legacy of Nazi Germany, and this is the lesson it leaves for all who inherit the future.